Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Brewtiful. I'm Anthony, and today I want to talk to you about one of the most iconic, one of the most well-recognized, and one of the most popular beer brands to ever exist in the entire history of the world. Now, when I say things like most iconic, most well-known, I'm talking about a serious household name, something that I think most people around the world would recognize and would at least know what it is. And you might think about brands like Guinness or Heineken or maybe even like a Budweiser, the king of beers. Well, I actually want to talk about something a little bit more well known. I want to talk about the one, the only Duff Beer from The Simpsons. You probably already knew that. It is that recognized. Duff Beer started out as a, completely fake, a fictional, made-up, animated cartoon product, And it's been on air in almost every single Simpsons episode ever. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes spanning 30 years. And The Simpsons is one of the most well-known and most popular IPs to ever exist, certainly in the animated world. Despite all of that, I think it's fair to say that most people don't think about or don't know the history behind Duff Beer, both in the animated space and in the real world. So I wanted to shed some light on this incredibly iconic brand. Now, before we get into it, I do need to put out a little bit of a disclaimer because it is a beloved IP and there are a lot of people who feel very, very passionate about The Simpsons. When I talk about the history of Duff Beer, particularly the animated history, we are going to talk about the full scope, the extended universe of The Simpsons. I'm talking comics, I'm talking crossovers and spin-offs. We're talking the full gambit. So not everything that people would consider quote-unquote canon in a sometimes not very canonized show to begin with. It's not very linear, but despite that, there are going to be some things that come from alternative media, not just the animated series, to get the full story behind Duff Beer. So just prepare for that. So without further ado, let's learn some stuff about that wonderful Duff. The story of Duff actually begins all the way back in 1989 in the writer's room for The Simpsons. And they were trying to come up with something that would be able to replicate, but also kind of poke fun of a classic American staple, because that's what The Simpsons has always done and has always kind of been about, poking fun of the standard American life in exaggerated and crazy ways. At least more so in the beginning, for sure. Duff was intended to be the typical American pale adjunct lager, that cheap, shelfy beer that all those 80s and 90s dads were chugging all the time. Take for example the first appearance of Duff in the actual episodes of The Simpsons in Season 1, Episode 1, and look at this commercial.
Out of work, sober? You sat around the house all day, but now it's Duff time. Duff, the beer that makes the days fly by.
Beer. Now there's a temporary solution.
Now compare it to the Hamm's commercials from around that same time period.
If you're looking for a beer that's born wet and clear, born in the land of sky blue waters, then reach for a Hamm's, reach for a Hamm's, Hamm's, the beer you've been looking for.
I think it's fair to say that they're kind of similar. Now, before any Simpsons fans jump down my throat, I know technically Duff did appear in the 6th skit of the Tracy Ullman Show where Homer was walking around with a unspecified red label that we could assume became Duff because of the similar aesthetics, but it didn't have a brand name on it at that time and it wasn't referenced as Duff. So yeah, that might technically be its first appearance, but it wasn't officially Duff until The Simpsons became its own spin-off thing. Now, there's also several theories revolving around what inspired those writers to choose Duff. One actually came from an old-timey theatrical play. The play was called Landscapes, in which a couple named Beth and her brewery-working husband Duff worked through the trials and tribulations of married life, which The Simpsons could be alluding to. A lot of similarities there. However, I think that's a bit far-fetched. Sure, The Simpsons pull from a lot of popular culture and even some pretty deep cuts like this play, but I still think that's a bit of a stretch. I think that's more, forcing that puzzle piece into a specific position. Another theory suggests that Duff Beer was actually inspired by Duff McKinnon of Guns N' Roses. He was sometimes referred to as the king of beers, and he talks all the time about how Duff was inspired after him because of his legendary drinking. Well, that seems to not be true at all. The whole debate revolving around the inspiration of Duff Beer and why it's called Duff and everything like that was actually revealed in Springfield Confidential, where the writer Mark Rice actually described it as being rather ordinary. The slogan, "Can't get enough of that wonderful something." They needed something that rhymed with enough to make the catchphrase rhyme, since the catchphrase was pretty much already written and solidified. And just off the top of his head, he came up with Duff. Can't get enough of that wonderful Duff. Kind of a bit anticlimactic, but kind of interesting that even just around the name, there was so much, style biting and a little bit of lore in there. It's incredibly fair to say Duff Beer does draw a ton of inspiration from Budweiser. I definitely think that they were certainly trying to poke a lot of fun at, one of the biggest beer brands at that time. Duff Beer has Duff Gardens, where Anheuser-Busch has Busch Gardens that was created by their famous patriarch Gussie Busch. There's also K. Duff the 7th and 8th, which strike a extremely strong resemblance to August Busch the 3rd and 4th, who were the CEO of Anheuser at that point in time and heir to the legacy and Budweiser throne and all that. And they actually kind of acted alike. Both the Bushes were kind of known for being a bit of jerks, and Henry K. Duff the 7th and 8th certainly kind of personify that same energy in the episodes they appear in.
Old Ogdenville Ale, he drinks a competitor. Reverse the confetti. Check the fat guy for tattoos.
The similarities between the two brands get even closer when you look at the mascots. Duffman and Suds McDuff, who are parodies of the short-lived Budweiser mascots Budman and Suds McKenzie. Throughout the entire run of the show, Duff certainly took a lot of inspiration from some of the other big-name brands, but without a doubt, Budweiser had to have been their source of inspiration. Now, moving on to the animated history of Duff Beer. As I mentioned, it's appeared in almost all 700 episodes in one way or another, even if it's just like an advertisement or something like that. And there's even episodes that base completely around Duff, like the episode where they go to the Duff Brewery and things like that. But it really doesn't dive too deep into the actual history of Duff Beer. It still kind of paints it as just some all existing common brand, which may be on purpose. But there's a lot of things that we can pull from context clues that could provide a little insight into the foundation, the history behind the iconic fictional brand. There's some context clues that could indicate that Duff Beer was an old European brand that got brought over to America, like much of the early beer baron brands did, to include Budweiser. In season 4, episode 16, Duffless, Homer and Barney tour the Duff Brewery, and you can see some German aesthetics in the decorating, use of the Black Forest cuckoo clocks and steins. Also in the Simpsons Hit and Run video game, the official soundtrack has the Duff Brewery theme song, which resembles traditional German folk music. However, much like Budweiser, again, it could just be that it's kind of trying to bolster that immigrant, old world type heritage and aesthetic to its brands and its marketing, without it actually being a prior existing brand over in Europe. However, if we look to some of the external media that we talked about earlier, I think it's much fair to say that Duff Beer was actually an American-made product, born and raised right here in the USA. In the 18th issue of Bart's Treehouse of Horrors comic, Homer tricks the family into taking a road trip to visit the cabin of Duff's founder, Henry K. Duff, where he supposedly created the original recipe, which was apparently written in the Boontling language. The recipe includes an ounce of hops per 6 pounds of dried malt, which is then filtered through a gem sock in order to create the most delicious, yet watered down beer. And interestingly, I don't know if this was just a throwaway statement, but since they were referencing Boontling, I had to imagine that they had some context and some background knowledge of what beer actually is, and Homer actually describes it as an ale, which is rather surprising since I think pretty much everybody would have assumed it was, a lager, a pale adjunct lager, but it seems like it was lacking any adjuncts unless you consider a gem sock as an adjunct. maybe, but definitely interesting. Also, I probably shouldn't have read that out loud since it seems that the recipe is actually some type of incantation possible of creating a living dead type scenario, so hope it don't go too bad for me tonight.
But if that isn't enough to convince you, there was one other instance within the animated series that did discuss Duff's secret recipe.
Mr. Duff, can I ask what's in this safe?
Little lady, inside that safe is the formula for Duff itself, known only to 3 people. And the combination is not known to any human... What the?
Schlitz plus water.
Now, when talking about Duff Beer, the brand, it's kind of interesting to think about. It kind of gives off the aesthetic as possibly being something of like a regional powerhouse, like maybe a Yuengling, or in the craft beer world, you'd have things like Sierra Nevada or some of the older legacy breweries. Since in The Simpsons, there's only 2 instances of showing brewery production houses, and it seems that there's only 2 in the greater extended universe canon. One in Springfield and one in Capital City. But they could also be something of like an international conglomerate since they offer so many beers, so much brewing capacity, and also they have so many international brands that are only available outside of the US.
Everything going dark, like Duff Stout, the beer that made Ireland famous. I love you, Doris. Ooh.
Malaysian Duff brewed with soy sauce, 2 different Canadian Duffs, one brewed with codeine and another brewed with Canadian rain.
Duff Beer, feel no pain, made from Canadian rain.
And the incredibly elusive Nordic Doof. And as I mentioned, there are a ton of domestic offerings as well, way more than any type of like small regional powerhouse could brew. There's Duff Light, Duff Dry, and of course Duff Regular. Although, much like real life, it can be kind of hard to tell those 3 distinct beer brands apart from each other. For those whale seekers out there, Duff also offers a wide variety of products of varying quality levels for the more discerning drinker.
Seems awfully overproduced.
There's ultra premium Henry K. Duff's Private Reserve for those days you really want to celebrate. For the more crafty consumers, there's Gummy Bear Duff, Lady Duff, Raspberry Duff, Duff Dark, and for all you health nuts out there, there's Tartar Control Duff and Calcium Duff. Speaking of being a regional offering, in the Simpsons Family Guy crossover episode, it was shown that Duff Beer was actually sold in Rhode Island in Quahog as Pawtucket Pat Patriots Ale. Kind of alluding to that ale sense that we got from earlier, huh? Kind of interesting. I don't know. But to be fair, Duff has always been a little bit weird when it comes to marketing techniques. I mean, anybody remember the Duff 7-pack?
The Duff 7-pack! One more for the road! There's nothing symmetrical about flavor. So get your 7-pack today! It looks wrong, but it is oh so right! Oh yeah!
Unfortunately, it does not seem that Duff existed into the far future. It didn't survive the alien invasions and everything like that, because several thousand years later, in Futurama, Duff Beer, as far as I was able to find, did not make any appearance on New Earth. They prefer brands like Lowbrow and Pat's Blue Robot. And unfortunately, that kind of concludes everything that we were able to really gain insight from the actual animated Simpsons episodes and a bit of extended lore there. But there was another crossover event that actually made Duff so much more interesting, in my opinion, and gave us a lot more to sink our teeth in. And that was when it made the crossover into the real world. That almost never happened. See, Simpsons creator Matt Groening, however you want to pronounce it, he has been very vocal and open about the fact that he did not want Duff Beer to become a real alcoholic beverage because he thought it would be destructive and detrimental to young children, encouraging them to drink underage. And he didn't want that responsibility, didn't want that guilt, didn't want that to befall on his brand, which was already kind of seen as like a cavity for the mind of young children. Surprisingly, Fox was actually rather on board. You know, you kind of think about them as this like money-hungry ultra conglomerate, which they are. But it's interesting to see that they weren't as much of a vampire as they could have been. They actually seemed to respect Matt's wishes, and they actually filed a ton of lawsuits against some of the fake brands that were popping up here and there, you know, counterfeit or just pure IP theft Duff releases. Most notably, there was one case in Australia where a brewery was trying to release a beer labeled Duff, you know, very similar in aesthetic and very close to the actual representation on the show. But they actually got, you know, sued by Fox, cease and desist, and they tried to fight it all the way up to the Australian Supreme Court, where it was shut down and proven you can't do this. This is IP theft. Unfortunately, that didn't stop all of the counterfeit products. There were products popping up in Chile and Mexico, and the Chile one was actually pretty interesting because the fakery, there was so much counterfeit Duff beer on the market in Chile that they actually had to have like cop busts breaking up the rings.
It looks like Duff, and by all accounts tastes like Duff. But unfortunately for Homer Simpson, it's not in fact Springfield's favourite beer. The bogus brew has turned up in Chile, with 20th Century Fox saying producers don't have permission to use the name made famous by The Simpsons. An investigation has now been launched, with authorities having confiscated up to 69,000 labels and bottles, which sounds like Homer's idea of heaven.
But even that didn't stop it. So Fox did something that I didn't think they actually would do. Or kind of, maybe, I don't know. They actually released an officially licensed Duff beer alcoholic brand in Chile in order to combat the counterfeits. They're like, if everyone's going to keep selling it, keep making this, you know, black market, we're going to go in there, we're going to solidify the brand, we are going to solidify our legal rights in Chile to combat these counterfeits, these fakes. And it seemed to be moderately successful.
The German counterfeit Duff is widely available and has gone through a little bit of a legal ringer throughout the EU and even overseas in both America and Australia. Yet it is somehow been able to fend off and fight off all attempts from the Fox network to stop it.
And it really is a shame that this beer was resorting to IP theft, you know, biting off of somebody's original idea and concept and brand in order to sell their product, because genuinely, this is a fantastic beer. It is so incredibly well made. It's one of the better examples of like Pilsner that I've actually had in Germany. I mean, it's really good. As time went on and as The Simpsons became less and less of a cultural icon, you know, the later seasons, y'all know what I'm talking about. I believe, you know, I don't have any proof of this, but I believe that, you know, the massive cash that it was raking in started to wither, you know, a little bit. It's still a powerhouse for sure, but it certainly started to wither. And I think Fox became a little bit more inclined to start releasing Duff products into the real world. Most notably, in 2013, they actually had a real world Simpsons Springfield crossover where they took a city in the United States and they converted the 7-Elevens into Quickie Marts. And in there you could buy a ton of Simpsons labeled brands straight from the show, you know, other products marketed and designed to look exactly like Simpsons products, to include a Duff can that was more of an energy drink and didn't have any alcohol in it, but still that saw it tiptoeing its feet into the real world. Things changed a bit in 2013 when a Springfield Simpsons chunk was established in the Universal Studios theme park. There was like a whole area, still area, dedicated to The Simpsons. And there you could actually go into a real world recreation of Moe's Tavern. And in there you could order a Duff beer, an officially licensed, official real world alcoholic adult beverage beer From all the reviews I've seen, it's actually pretty good, but man, I find it hard to believe it's going to be this good. Again, before you go jumping to conclusions thinking that Fox was actually really just, playing fan service, I still think it's probably fair to say that this was in order to counteract counterfeits. I think that this was kind of their way, not only making an appealing tourist draw, but I think it was a way of tiptoeing into the real world in the American sense to protect their brand. There is now an officially licensed Duff, and now if you make a counterfeit Duff, they could sue you legitimately and officially. The whole argument of, oh, there's not a real Duff, so we're not actually ripping off IP, or we're not actually breaking somebody's copyright because it's not a real product, that all goes completely out the window. They still haven't rolled it out on a national sense or an international sense, or you can't buy it outside of the park, but I do believe if there is enough fervor and if there is enough desire for it, and maybe if that cash pools start sinking a little bit more, there is a chance that we might see a national or even global rollout, and I think that would be really cool. What the future holds for Duff Beer, still to be determined, except for the far future where it's dead and gone. I'm excited to see it. I really think there is a ton of potential in Duff Beer. I think there's a ton of potential in, I think it's called reverse marketing, where you take a fictional brand, you get people attached to it, drawn to it, and then you release it into the real world as fan service. There's actually been a ton of studies done revolving around Duff and some other products like that, where they've kind of analyzed the unlimited potential that reverse beer brand marketing could have. And I do plan on doing a video completely on that in the future, so stay tuned for that. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed it. It's a little bit different than what I normally do on this channel, but it was still beer history enough that I couldn't resist. I had to do it. And if I got something wrong, or if there's something I missed or left out, please let me know, because I want to learn more. So thank you. Like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.